Hello, everybody. Welcome to a new episode of the Dissenter. I'm your host, as always, Ricardo Lopes, and today I'm joined by Dr. Radu Umbreș. He is a lecturer at the Faculty of Political Science at the National School for Political Studies and Public Administration in Romania. He does research in social anthropology, cognitive science, and evolutionary psychology. And today we're going to talk about his book, Living with Distrust, Morality, and Cooperation in a Romanian Village. So, Dr. Umbreș, welcome to the show. It's a pleasure to have you on.
Thank you, Ricardo. I'm very happy that you have invited me, and hello to everyone watching this.
Great. So, before we get into the village itself, you studied Sateni. Let me just start with a more general question. So, what is ethnography? Because it's basically what you did here, and how should it be done properly if we really want it to be done scientifically from an anthropological perspective?
Yeah, it's a very good question, one that anthropologists, because they have pondered upon since the beginning of our discipline, and I'm not really sure there is one single correct or simple answer to it. In broad terms, it's a way of studying people in their natural environment, in naturalistic settings, where the researcher becomes embedded in a certain society, in certain social relationships, in the social ecology of that place, and the researcher is trying to get a perspective from within, so to speak. So it's based on one hand, observation, but it's mostly more of an active, like a participant observation, because we're not just flies on the wall, so we're still there as actors. Right? So we look around and we try to understand what's going on. Then, of course, you get to know people, you establish certain relationships with them, and that itself may become an object of study, the way you interact with others. Then you get to know them, and of course, then you have conversations. Sometimes they might be like structured interviews, but mostly it's like everyday life. And I think that Maurice Bloch, one of the anthropologists that I greatly admire, I think he said somewhere that we are all anthropologists in our lives. It's just that we do it unreflectively, because we look around and we try to understand how others think, how to interpret a certain situation, how we should behave, and so on. So, in a way, the anthropologist is doing exactly the same thing as everybody else, only with this added layer of reflexivity, always asking himself or herself, what does this mean? What is actually going on in the minds of others? Why do they do this? And of course, a key part of anthropology, especially since its beginning, was studying people who are very different to one's own society. So we have this element of meeting what was used to be called exotic people, so to speak. And of course, this was more in the first decades. Nowadays, anthropologists are studying societies closer to home, or even, as in my case, people from their own society. But of course, even in that case, there will be some significant differences. And whenever you're looking at people with this reflexive lens, there will be all kinds of puzzling behaviors, or certain concepts they're using, certain narratives, and at first they might seem incomprehensible. So then the scholarly effort is to try to make sense of it. And of course, you said it's how should we do it scientifically? And I guess this is I think most anthropologists, or many anthropologists, would not bother with this idea of science, since our methods, well, to be honest, they don't really follow certain rules that you'll find, for example, in experimental methods. There is no control group. There is just one test group. So it's really hard to replicate what you have observed. There is always this risk, or some people would say it's an opportunity for subjectivism. So, for example, maybe I look at a certain ritual and I see certain things, I have a certain interpretation. Another anthropologist might see something completely different. And of course, this I think for some scientific perspectives, it looks really messy, and it is. But on the other hand, this is the price you have to pay if you want to study people in their natural environment, since you cannot put some people in one part and other people in another part of the study. Everything just goes, and in a way you're not really controlling anything. Yeah. Better said, it's the locale, it's the people who are controlling their own lives, and you're just more or less a passive observer. But of course there should be certain, let's say, maybe rules is a strong word, but certain good advices that we receive from other people who did ethnography and fieldwork, which is such as that one should become as much immersed as possible in that certain society. I mean, not to look at it from the porch, so to speak. Well, what are the natives doing? But in a way, becoming one of them. So participating as much as possible in certain activities, becoming friends, sometimes like fictive kin with the people there. And getting and in the same time cutting as much as possible from your relationships with the other society. So in a way you become dependent upon that society to accept you, to interact with you, and in this sense you have to learn. I mean, it is like a kid entering a new world, because you have to understand how to behave, what to say, what are the relationships between people, and so on. So you have in a way to cut your cord with let's say the academic world and your own people, and become, well, not necessarily become one of them, because this idea of becoming native is quite problematic, and to be honest, you'll never become one of them. But in a way to try to get as much as possible in that position in which you can start at least a little bit seeing the world the way they are doing. So, and I think this is something that really ethnography can bring to the table that perhaps other perspectives won't have access to. Of course, learning the language as much as possible, that's really, really important. Developing meaningful social relationships with the people, and of course, on the other hand, even the problems of making relationships might be interesting in itself. Why certain parts of society not accessible to oneself, and then and in a way, I think a lot of people are saying that it's more of a form of art than science, because each society is so different. Each anthropologist is very, very different. So there hardly is one-size-fits-all advice for ethnography. But at the same time, I guess a form of common sense and deep curiosity probably is essential for a good ethnography. And in a way, it's this idea of not taking anything for granted or thinking that you know anything. In a way, like question everything in your own mind, but also questioning the people.
But even with all that subjectivism you referred to that is associated with ethnography and fieldwork, what would you say they add to the picture of anthropology, apart from just having some sort of theoretical approach or doing things from the armchair?
Well, First of all, your position there allows you to observe certain phenomena that might look entirely different if you put them in a lab, or if you read about, I don't know, let's say some third-party accounts of a phenomenon. For example, if you observe like a ritual, like a funeral, of course you might read about it, and for example, in the kind of fieldwork I did, there was a lot of material on rituals. But then again, those are partial accounts, because some people are interested in, let's say, songs, right? So you can read a song, you can read the lyrics of a song, you can interpret it, but then being there allows you to see when is that song being used, who does it, are there any variations from one event to the other event. So all this kind of serendipity of events might be very, very important. And of course, there is all this talk about, for example, like kinship or politics. And of course, theoretical accounts have to be, in a way, simplified. And of course, a lot of anthropologists are really averse to this idea of reductionism, that we shouldn't reduce complex social phenomena to simple mechanisms. And well, I tend to disagree, because I think that reductionism is necessary in science. Otherwise, I mean, if you have like a complete and utter exact account, it would be like that famous, I think there was that story by Borges, where you have a map which is as big as a territory. And of course, such a map is not really useful. So you do have to reduce things. But then again, where anthropologists are right is that we shouldn't reduce more than it's necessary, because sometimes you might drop out something which is really, really important, right? And for example, nowadays I've become quite interested in the literature on how kids start to imitate rituals or other instrumental practices. And so what we see in the lab is very, very different than what happens in naturalistic settings. And there you can actually see when, how, and which kids will start imitating or not. What are the kind of interactions that allow for imitation or teaching to take place, and so on. And such things, if you reduce them to a very simple narrative account from the outside, or if you put them in a lab, you might lose some fundamental elements of the phenomenon. And of course, that all human and social sciences are trying to discuss about all these phenomena like cooperation, morality, rituals, and so on. But what I try to get at is how they happen in everyday life, like with real people in real contexts, places with certain ecology and history and so on. And if you abstract away many elements, then perhaps you might see certain mechanisms at work, and that's great. But then you might ignore many others, which are not only important as additional factors, but they might interact with that phenomenon you're looking at. So yeah, that's in a way the advantage, but also the difficulty of ethnography, of giving you this really rich account of human social life.
Mm-hmm. So let's get into Sateni then. What is Sateni, and how did you end up studying it?
Sateni is a village in northeast Romania. It's so towards the border with Ukraine and Moldova, that area. It's in a rather poor region of Romania. Although the village is not necessarily poor by local standards. And how I got there, it's one of those stories that anthropologists have, because I was not supposed to go there. My initial fieldwork was supposed to be in Athens, Greece, working with the Romanian migrants. I was interested in things like entrepreneurship in the construction industry, and I was sort of prepared for this in terms of like theory and hypothesis. I made some connections. I made some preliminary trips to Athens, but then the global crisis hit in 2007, 2008, and the construction industry collapsed. And in Athens, in particular, many people were out of a job, and most of them started going home. So I really had, I was basically overnight, I was left without a topic because there was no longer entrepreneurship there, no longer migrants. So I was really in a crisis. I was quite desperate. But my coordinator, Michael Stewart, was quite supportive. He said that, well, this happens to a lot of anthropologists. Whatever we plan doesn't always pan out in the field. And he was supportive of saying, well, I don't know, find something else, so improvise. So what I decided to do is, since I already had some very good personal connections with some people who were going home, I decided to follow them and then figure it out. So I was, since I was back to the drawing board, as I said, back to square one. Just okay, I'll just go with them, and I will look and see whatever is fascinating or interesting there, and I will manage somehow. And I had a chance, since one of my best, well, more than informants, I would say, friends, needed a driver to go back home, since he had a car and he was driving around Athens, but he didn't have a driving license. Somehow he managed to to escape police, but now he had to go back to Romania, and I had the driving license. And I said, okay, great, I'll drive you there. So we took a very long trip, and we started talking about things. I already saw some interesting patterns of distrust between Romanians, and I was asking him all this. So we got to his village, and this was the village of Sateni. And once I got there, so he hosted me. He presented me to his family, to his relatives, to his friends, and I started. Well, I was really like airdropped in a new place, and I was trying to get my bearings. So what is happening here? What is this society? What? I mean, I had no hypothesis. I think this was, on the one hand, it was really difficult, but on the other hand, I think, retrospectively, it was something which helped me a lot, since I had no expectations. I was not looking for something in particular. I just, in a way, let the field show me or point to me some interesting phenomena that I should follow. And the thing that, in a way, started appearing at every step was this idea of distrust, or perhaps, again, as this is the subjective perspective, perhaps for me this was very interesting. The fact that people had so little trust in people in general, in other villagers, and on the other hand, they seemed to trust friends and relatives a lot, but then there was a lot of distrust towards them as well. So since I stumbled upon this element everywhere, I decided that, okay, this is interesting, and I want to pursue and look, what are the effects of this trust, where does it come from, what is trust, what is distrust, and so on. And then I started field work by this kind of participant observation, also by taking a position in that society, which is that the guy I took home, he started a construction business, like a really small construction business in his village in Sateni, and I became his apprentice. So this gave me some sort of identity. So I wasn't just there like scooping around like a spy. I started as a worker and in a construction team, and this was a very very good chance to enter into people's homes, to interact with their families. Since I was not just barging in with questions, I was just one of the guys working there, and I had this story. I'm a student and I'm studying this village, but I also work here, and this made people much more open to my presence there. So in a way, this was quite a lucky interaction of my choices and the way they were willing to receive people. So yeah, and about the village, it's so it's a village with about, let's say, about 1,000 people, perhaps less now because there's a huge migration from that place. It's in the area is mostly about agriculture, so there is cereals and animals. The people, I mean, according to local standards, they have, let's say, perhaps above average land ownership. So people from other villages said that they owned more land, and it seems to be the case. But the area is like some low-lying hills with some fields. It gets really hot in the summer, really cold in the winter. And from a EU point of view, it's probably one of the poorest regions in Europe. And the people there, it's a really quite a problematic term. I think we might call them, or most of them, peasants, and they are in a way associated with a peasant way of life. Perhaps they might be like the last peasants of Europe in a way, but definitely we could not call them farmers, for example. I mean, that would give a really wrong idea about their livelihood.
So, and what were the aspects of their sociality you focused the most on, and why? I mean, what would you say is most characteristic of Sateni villagers?
One thing I would like to say is that when I talk about this village, people ask me, so what is fascinating or particular about this village? I can't say I found something which is so specific to this village that you would not find in a village like 20 kilometers away, or even in many other villages in Romania. So there's nothing exceptional about it. Of course, it does have a particular history and certain things which are unique, but the kind of things that I've noticed there, and I have since come to know, they are probably broadly characteristic of a large part of rural Romania, and definitely of that area of the northeast of what is called Moldavia, that province. So as I said, I entered as an anthropologist with no hypothesis, with not a clue. I didn't even research the area a lot because I didn't have much time. But the first thing that struck me was the importance of kinship. And in a way, this is something, I mean, it reminded me of the classical anthropologists going to what was called primitive societies, which were really organized around kinship. And even though this is part of, let's say, a state country and so on, apparently modern, kinship was present there at every point. So people were interacting a lot with their relatives. The use of kin terms was ubiquitous. They emphasized how important kinship is to them in terms of the family, first of all, then the extended network of kin. And this was, for me, at least coming from urban Romania, this was in a way, well, surprising. I mean, I was not I knew that kinship was important in a village society, but then again, it's quite different when you actually experience it. And when you start seeing that, for example, when I started meeting people, it was all the first network was this network of relatives. So somebody presented me to his relative, and then that relative presented me to somebody else, and I started. The first impression I got is that kinship is one of the organizing factors of the village society. So that was for me. While something like, let's say, friendship or professional networks was to a much lesser extent present. So this was one of the things that really impressed me, and this is something I followed. Then one thing that that struck me was the importance of this nexus of family and household. And for people, it's in a way it's their center of the world. So in a way, their house, the people living there, and everything that they have around the house, like tools, animals, land, and so on. That for them is like axis mundi, so the whole world revolves around that place. And I was impressed of how much they cared and they thought about this place. I mean, it was more than it's not only like a home, but it's like a relationship of production and reproduction. Their social status is expressed through the household and so on. So it's a really household-based society. Right? In comparison with other places, which did not seem so important for them. So that was another thing that and then, of course, this the next things that were in a way puzzling for me was a sense of suspicion that I had towards other villagers in general, and first of all, this was something that was for me quite hard to, not necessarily to understand, but it was hard to cope with. Since, my background, in a way, probably made me much more trustworthy of people. And at each step, my close friends and connections there, informants, they were always warning me about others. And in a way, I mean, it's a form of social pedagogy, telling me that, oh, you're naive, you're just a student, you don't know anything about life, they're going to trick you, they're going to lie to you. And I found this in an ethnography by Campbell of the Sateni, and he really put it in a precise word, this sense of being under siege. So anyway, this reflected the way I experienced it and the way I saw other people living their lives, is that there is always a diffuse and present sense of social peril. That there are people out there who might, in one way or another, harm you. And you should be really, really careful with all your social interactions to avoid things like predation or exploitation and deception and so on. So, in a way, I mean, I'm not convinced that it's the perfect word, but it did give a sense of a Hobbesian worldview. That everybody's on their own. And of course, for me, this was a bit. It was a bit difficult to see why this is going on, and especially to adapt to it. But then again, as I spend more and more time there, I started. I'm not necessarily sure. I started looking at other people with suspicion as well, but I could understand how suspicion could appear and it could reproduce between people. Since people are suspicious of you, you sometimes become suspicious of them as well. So this was another element that fascinated me. And then, as I started to see more and more, so there was this the great value that they placed upon their house. Since for a lot of people who are migrating, most of the money they've earned was invested into houses, and these houses were quite huge according to local standards. Sometimes I thought they were like irrationally large. I mean, why would they spend so much money there? And this was something I tried to understand. As I got to know more and more, then I started encountering things like the political life. And this, in a way, I was familiar to external accounts of things like corruption or the kind of problems of bad administration. But again, these are more like journalistic accounts or theoretical accounts. But then I started to look more and more to see how they actually happen, like in a certain society. How do people think about them? What do they what is for them, if corruption, whether they moralize it or not, what are the kind of things they're looking for in politicians and so on. So there was this another element. And then, of course, in a way, it's like a really classical anthropological monograph, trying to get perspective on each of the important elements of life, like politics, then religion, then the economy, how they get a livelihood, and the sort of social organization and kinship and so on. So I've tried to explore as much as possible each of these elements, and in all of them trying to see what is the role of distrust there. So this was in a way and then when the big overarching question was, so how does this society actually manage to reproduce and to exist, even though it has such high levels of distrust? Since coming from, my background told me that trust is the social cement, right? This is what keeps societies together. But apparently, this society, without having any kind of like huge conflicts, any kind of social fractures, could exist with quite high levels of distrust. And this was, for me, was in a way fascinating. I wanted to understand this. And then, and finally, in a way, and what I've tried to do across the entire book is to explain why such high levels of distrust are in a way a reasonable outlook on life. So it's not pathological, it's not an error, or it's not irrationality, but there are good reasons why this distrust exists and reproduces.
We will get into that later on in the interview, but you've already touched on that, but in the book you really talk about the sharp discontinuity between the world outside and inside the household. So is there any explanation for that? Do you have any account of it? Where does that come from, really?
Yeah. So one of the things which is fascinating, I started looking at material culture. I wasn't interested in that before, but I started seeing how important for them, for example, is the fence. And for the fence for them is a really, really important element of their household. They say you can judge a household by the state of its fence. So the fence, in a way, is that barrier, is that boundary between the household and the exterior, and I think it expresses in material elements a certain outlook upon life. It has to be strong. It has to be impenetrable. It should protect also against physical intrusion, but also against epistemic intrusion. And of course, by working as a construction worker, I could also see how they thought about creating the house, what kind of the sort of architecture, the kind of plans they had. And one thing that's fascinating is that If you just walk on the street and you look towards the houses, you realize that the whole appearance is in a way staged. So people really think about how their household is going to look like from the outside. That's why they take a lot of caution with where they are going to place their valuables, so they should not be seen in a way. I mean, they have to be hidden in a way. And starting from this material culture, then I started to understand that it's a more general outlook. That for them, the household is like the safe sphere of life. This is the place where they feel secure, where they feel surrounded by the most important moral relationships that one has in the world. That's where you keep the most valuable things. So it's valuable people and also valuable things, and their whole social existence somehow revolves around this space. And what lies outside this space? Well, in a way, when you cross the boundary, it's also a moral border that's being crossed. So the kind of social relationships one has outside the household are in a way different than those inside. So it's clear that the kind of social life one has in this safe space is different from the social life outside it. And of course, if you look at what the households represent, we can see that even beyond the many symbols associated with them, the household is a unit of, it's an economic unit. So it's really linked with the way they're making a life. So it has, since, as I said, most of them are peasants, let's say agriculturalists. So this is where you'll store all your grains, where you have all your implements, all your tools. The animals are also there. There's usually a patch of land attached to the house, and they grow other essentials there. So most of what they own in life is placed exactly there. I mean, they won't. I mean, they don't have a lot of money, but even if they have them, they don't really store them in banks or other things. They keep them close to home. And actually, again, talking about this, what you can see in ethnography that perhaps is not easily accessible to, you can see how people, how they feel like and how they act when they're outside the household, in the village or in the market or so on. And you could see that they're in a bit tense, they're in a bit looking at certain perils, and the sense of confidence and inner peace they get when they're inside their household. So there's this kind of subjective transformation that you can witness, that when they're sort of touching their household, when they're there in their space, they're in a way like the king in his castle, so they feel protected, they feel safe, and in a way that and most of the things that are important in life are there, right, in terms of people and things and symbols and so on. And I think, and again, this is not necessarily something which is only found there. I mean, there are many. I think in many peasant societies, you have this very, very strong connection between people and their households for, again, economic and social kinship and political reasons. And then what happens outside, it's a different game. So in a way that if you look at in the household, you have something which in a way might be seen like kind of a communal sharing, right? Well, all the people are sharing together. You don't keep accounts and so on. But this won't happen outside the household. There are different social rules outside this household. And of course, households are not monads. They're not entirely isolated from society, but they are social units in a way. And people will also think about other people in connection to their household. So when you think about an individual, you'll immediately associate him with a certain place and with certain people. So this constructs the idea of who a person is. Right? What's his house? What does he own? What is his family like? And so on. So this is a way. This is your social card, so to speak. And they do place a lot of emphasis on this, and it appears everywhere, like in sayings. For example, let me give you one example. So if you want to say that a man he's faithful to his wife, he's not drinking too much, so he's one of these like esteemed person, you'd say something like he's a good householder. So somebody who really cares for his household is somebody who has like a good social status, and they will actually use like homme de casa, and so like a man of the house, to say that yeah, this is a worthy person in a way. While someone who doesn't care for his household is, there's something suspicious about him. So he's unreliable. He's spending too much time or too many resources outside, and people would not hold him in high esteem. And again, this appears also in like songs or sayings and so on. So the house is really present all over these kind of discourses. And as I said, this distinction that once you cross from the household outside, there's a different world. And something that I realized is, for example, the importance of thresholds. So thresholds are appearing, and there are a lot of superstitions about them, and they appear in rituals and so on. And the threshold is exactly that connection point between the household and the outside. So, as anthropology said, it's like a liminal space. So they're surrounded with ideas like danger. You should not sit, for example, on a threshold, because it connects two places which are qualitatively different. So, and you can see this. And there was another idea that I wanted to say, is that so when you're an ethnographer studying a peasant society, it's fascinating when you start looking at ethnographies from other societies, peasant or like agriculturalists and so on, and you start seeing this kind of recurrent phenomena or recurrent patterns that you can see. You can find them in Romania, you can find them in Greece, in Spain, but then you can find them in like Africa or Asia and so on. And you can start, and then you can understand that it's not necessarily something specific to that place, but to an interaction of certain social relationships, certain form of social organization, a certain form of gaining a livelihood that might occur in different societies or across time, even given lots of other differences. But then you can apply this kind of comparative perspective between various ethnographic accounts. I think this is something quite useful for anthropologists, because when you say that, so what's a good advice for doing ethnography? Well, another one is comparing your own ethnography with other ethnographies, and to see what other people what are the kind of topics that they have looked into and the kind of phenomena they have traced.
Mm-hmm. But in the case of Sateni, even if such a big emphasis is put on kinship, is it really the case that people always trust their kin, and are their interests and decisions always aligned?
Definitely not. And that's another paradox that I've encountered since in my early days. I became convinced that they really trust their relatives, and these are the strongest moral relationships. But then their greatest, the kind of stories they had of malfeasance, of betrayal, the kind of people that they're the most important enemies were exactly relatives. So and this was what he was trying to say. I said, okay, I thought that kinship is your sphere of trust and morality, and now you're saying that, I mean, they have this saying, I mean, pardon my, I'm going to quote verbatim. They say something like, not even the devil fucks you like the relatives. Right? And for me, this was bewildering. So what's going on? I mean, even this is not a secure foothold for trust. But then I realized that that relatives are dangerous exactly because there is a certain default trust that you have in relatives that you don't have in others. So in a way, you become more exposed. I mean, you put yourself into higher risk with relatives, and than with non-relatives, like with what they call strangers. And since you are always in a defensive position towards strangers, when you lower your guard against relatives, that's when you become vulnerable. And that's why sometimes it happens that relatives might enter into some sort of a conflict. There might be betrayal, there might be various conflicts over things like inheritance or common projects. So it always has this kind of ambivalence towards it. You trust relatives, but on the other hand, you know that it's exactly because you trust them that they might be able in a way to harm you in a way that strangers won't. And of course, there are various reasons why kin relations might create conflicts. And a really important one, and with a long historical origin, is the issue of inheritance, especially land inheritance. So traditionally, the system was a partible inheritance. So the siblings will so each of the offspring will receive a share of land, some animals, tools, and so on, even some endowment to build a house and so on, and the shares were more or less equal, with a bit more, like an extra share for that child who stays at home to care for the parents in their old age, care for them, buries them, and so on. So it's an element of ultimogeniture there. The problem is that it looks simple. You just split things equally, but then it's really difficult since land has various qualities. So two pieces of land might not be you can't really compare them. One of them, maybe the soil is better, but another place is further from the village, and so on. If you start like splitting each piece, then you end up with these kind of strips of land, which are economically unproductive. And a lot of people do that. So it's a simple way, which has some really bad consequences, since you have this kind of land fragmentation, and somebody might own land in like 7 places, but it's only a little bit of land in each place. But then if you try to give one piece here and one piece there, all kind of squabbles might appear. Because then siblings will start thinking, oh, I treated my parents better. Why didn't I get more? Or why did that sibling get that piece of land I really wanted? There are so many elements there where you might get into conflict. And of course, siblings, the system of partible inheritance places siblings in a zero-sum conflict. There's only a limited amount of land and resources. They have to be split. If somebody gets more, automatically all the others are going to lose, or somebody is going to lose. And siblings, of course, are endowed, usually endowed at marriage or just before marriage. And so this creates an extra risk for those who come later, who are younger. So at all these various points, you have the potential for conflict. And of course, conflict doesn't always appear. Some siblings manage to get along fine, but then again, I think the most common kind of conflict was between brothers or sisters, who had a problem with sharing inheritance, and then this created a radical split between family lines. So they stopped speaking to each other, and adding to this problem, they might stop. So they might become something like might have like a tense relationship or even enemies. But they might still be neighbors. So they cannot even go somewhere else. They have to always see on the other side of the fence somebody that they really don't like, and this compounds the problems. Right? And of course, the one problem is that they did not have enough land. So everybody wants as much land as possible. So the land traditionally was the scarcest resource. And it was a vital matter to get as much as possible. Sometimes, so if it might be the difference between, survival or not. So this creates, this is one point which creates a lot of conflicts. Then other conflicts come when relatives try to work together. They might have like a common, maybe they want to like sow like grains together, or maybe they want to like have animals and so on. And again, the problem of splitting the revenues and so on, or who does how much work and so on, will start creating or offers the potential for conflicts. And in a way, it's only natural that if you're distrustful towards strangers, you won't interact with them. So there's not much opportunity of conflict. Conflict appears exactly with those people with whom you're going to interact. And if the social norms are driving you towards interaction with relatives, this is where the problems will appear. So there's always this really ambivalent position towards kin. And again, so you have relatives, and some of them you really, you love them and you interact with them and things are great there. And others, the situation is exactly the opposite. There's a lot of hate, suspicion, and so on, even though in genealogical terms, they might be just as close to kinds of relatives. And then again, a lot of relatives are like forgotten. I mean, you stop interacting with them because there's no opportunity for either good or bad interactions.
Mm-hmm. And is kinship in this case permanent? I mean, does it change? Can it change? And how do they decide who is kin and who isn't kin?
Yeah, this is one fascinating question. This is something I've been struggling a lot with. And this is when you start seeing that what people are saying, what people are doing, might not be equivalent. So if you ask them, so the discourse is that, blood is thicker than water. And they see that it's kind of the relationships of blood. They're given, they're essential, they're permanent, they're moral, and so on. So this is what might be called the ideology, right? But then you see that although kind of biological blood kinship is very, very important, then the actual social relationships will be a lot influenced by by what happens between people. I mean, what kind of relationships they have. They might, if they manage to get along fine, and of course a lot of other people will become relevant, since it's not, for example, between siblings, it's not only them, but it's also their spouses that will interact. So this adds another element where there might be either a good relationship. So I think at some point I said that in a way it looks like kinship looks like so the metaphor would be like a tree. So indeed, a tree does have like a natural origin. So you have like biological parents, and that's your first connection, and then you're also connected with your siblings and so on. But then as the tree grows, in a way, people are pruning their relationship. They will look at, okay, so I have these cousins, but they won't interact with all of them. they're going to look for those cousins who are friendlier, who are more generous, and of course there might be some idiosyncratic elements which make you closer to one family or another one, and all these kind of events that could happen. And then you have relationships of marriage, which extend further your horizon of kinship. And then again, another element in which you have an element of selectivity, because you might have good interactions with some of your affins, but not with others. And then you have ritual kinship, which comes and adds another layer, like godparenthood or wedding sponsors, and they become in a way kin, like ritual kin, but they also become part of this universe of social relations. So to answer your question, indeed, it starts. So the blueprint starts from this kind of genealogical model of kinship, in which pretty much everybody knows who is relative with whom. But then the actual social relationships of cooperation or conflict have a certain degree of freedom, and people will, in a way, they will fashion their universe of kinship as given what the others are going to do, given their interests, and so on. So they, for example, they have this saying. It's not even a saying; it's a way of talking. Is that of holding on to kin? So holding on to kin means something like, okay, we know we are kin, but holding on means we honor this relationship. So we acknowledge each other as being kin. So we call each other by our kin name. We participate in family rituals. So like things like funerals, baptism, and so on. When the other needs help, you offer it. Or if he comes and requires it, then you will be willing to help him. So it's this kind of to and fro, this kind of mutualism that keeps the kin relationship alive. And when people no longer hold each other as kin, they do have a genealogical relationship. People do know it. They can trace it. I mean, and they have an impressive memory of kinship going like 2, maybe even 3 generations back. But then it's just, I mean, they know they're kin, but if they don't hold on to it, it doesn't matter much for social purposes. I mean, it's like an empty vessel in a way. But for kinship to exist in practical terms, it has to be supplemented by pro-sociality, like cooperation.
Mm-hmm. And I would imagine that at least some of the conflict here would also stem from evolutionary phenomena like parent-offspring conflict, sibling conflict, parental uncertainty, and all of those kinds of things, correct?
Definitely. I mean, of course, so sometimes parents do tend to favor one sibling more than other siblings, and then, of course, this will create some sort of a conflict. And there is this interaction. I mean, there's always this interesting interaction between like evolved psychological mechanisms and what might be called like institutional mechanisms. For example, this partible inheritance. So these are the norms that people have to that govern behavior, right? Like inheritance, and partly they are backed by custom, but there is also like a legal element to them nowadays. For example, it's enshrined in law. But based on this infrastructure, institutional infrastructure, then come the kind of intuitions that people have about treating others, whether it's blood, like if it's a blood relative, like a genetic relative, or if it's an affine. And indeed, if you look at the kinship system, people do they do follow their intuitions. That, for example, a blood relative is in a way closer to you than another kind of relative, and so on. So this is one layer that's important. But there is another layer, and this is something that I've started to think more and more, and I think it needs more development, is that there's more, in terms of like cultural, social kinship, there's more than inclusive fitness. Right? I guess kinship also offers a system of cooperation, of mutualism, in a way, which interacts, but it's not, it cannot be reduced just to inclusive fitness concerns. Right? It's in a way like when you want, for example, if you're looking for a cooperative partner in a certain things. So the first people that you'll have in mind are your genetic, like blood relatives or really close affinites. And you might want to select them because there is already a pre-existing like relationship of reciprocity and so on. So you can build upon it. But then when people enter into this kind of cooperation, they expect others to be fair to them. So, and fairness is different than inclusive fitness concerns, right? In mutualism, you have these kind of expectations that, well, if we do an equal amount of effort, then we should split the results equally, or according to how much each has provided, or how rare the kind of resources each has brought to the table, and so on. And this is something I'm trying to I'm struggling with, how to pry apart these two elements. Since they're, I mean, even in evolutionary terms, they are different mechanisms. But in reality, in the messy reality, they come together very often.
And what aspects of human sociality, or in this case, social relationships, can we get a better understanding of by studying death rituals like funerals, for example?
Yeah, the mortuary rituals are, well, at least from what I've seen, they are the most important part of what might be called the Sateni religion. Right?
By the way, are people in Sateni Christians?
Yes, Christian Orthodox, so Greek Orthodox.
Okay.
Most of them, there are a few families that belong to kind of neo-Protestant movements, but by and large, the entire village is Christian, Greek Orthodox. Okay. We have a church that belongs to the Romanian Orthodox Church. So mortuary rituals are perhaps the most important element of their religious life, alongside things like baptism or weddings. And I became really fascinated with funerals, and I started attending them, since in a way there is something about the ritual itself and what happens there which gives you like an X-ray of social relationships. And if you think about it in a way, I might be waxing lyrically now, but humans are perhaps the only animal who is aware of death, and especially of their own death. Right? I think that for Sateni, death is an event which will tell something about their entire life. So I think they're thinking about that when you die, this is the terminus point, and it's the final reckoning, so to speak. And why is that? It's about what you're leaving behind. So, okay, so you die, you disappear as a person. They don't give much thought about an afterlife. Or they don't think so much about their afterlife as they think about what really happens with them, with their body, with their identity after death. And why is that? Is that because when you die, then there should be some people who will come to the front and they'll say, okay, this is our dead, right? So this is not, it's not a lone individual, it's our dead, and we will take care of him. And then they'll perform the rituals, the burial, and so on. And I think that, and I was asking myself, so what is the greatest fear that one has in life? And I think the greatest fear they have is this idea of dying alone. So, and not only dying alone, but being buried by the village. I mean, this is for them an idea of like utter shame. Because if you're being buried by the village, it means there's nobody there to take care of you. I mean, a dead that belongs to the village belongs to no one. So that's so in a way, the idea of a good life is that you die in your old age, and then there will be people, your children, your grandchildren, your relatives, and so on, who will perform all the rituals, right? And who will put in a lot of effort to ensure that you have a proper funeral. And it's a rather lengthy ritual, like 3 days of wake when you're dying, and again, so the traditional ritual is that when one dies, they're put in their house again in a ritual room, right? So they stay there, they're lying in state, and the family organizes like a ceremony, and everyone may come and visit and pay their respects. So again, you see this image of the house. So it's really important that the house, the dead is put there on the table, and people come and they forgive the dead and they pay their respects and so on. And there should be always someone with the dead for those 3 days. So they should never be alone there. There's a lot. So there's food there. There's drinks. The atmosphere is not, especially if it's like an old person. The atmosphere is rather relaxed. So even if there is grief and so on, it's a moment of rekindling social relations. So people will come even from other villages, sometimes from other parts of Romania, or even from abroad, to show that that person, that dead, meant something for them. So they're honoring their social relation. And then there is the entire funeral ritual, the actual burial. And just to pinpoint again this importance of the household. So the moment of the highest grief is not when the dead is put into the ground. It's when they leave the house. So when they leave the house, that's when people start like wailing, and there's a lot of pain, because there is that central connection that an individual has with their house, which is broken at that point, because they will never return home again. And that's really, really painful in a way. And a lot of the songs are about, so you have worked and you have fought so much for this house, and now you're leaving it and you'll never see it again. So it's really, really painful. But then you go and you join all the other dead in the cemetery. And in a way, the cemetery looks like the village social life in miniature. Because you also have like the little houses of the dead, all those graves, and you see all the social relationships of everyday life being reproduced in that place, that sacred place. You also have this. Everybody's focusing on their own grave, on their family grave, and they're surrounded by their biological relatives, and again they're in competition with all the others. There is a lot of so it's a competition for status, but sometimes it's even competition for like land. Again, just as they fight for land, for agricultural land, they fight for land in the graveyard. So for example, if a grave is left untended, so if the descendants have left the village, or if they don't care anymore, somebody will appropriate that piece of land, especially if it's in a good place. So no one will respect the dead of others. Everybody has to protect their own dead, just as they protect the living in the life. Of course, there's a lot of investment in the graves. They should be tended. They should be kept. So before certain holidays, people will come and they will take care of. They will clean it, put flowers and so on. And there's again a status game there. I mean, who has the largest grave closer to the main alleys with marble, iron, wrought iron, and so on. So it really reproduces. And actually, in the graveyard is the only place where you have all the or almost all the people in the village at the same time. So there is this holiday of the dead, and all the families will go to the cemetery, and they'll go to their grave, and it's quite a jolly day. So the atmosphere is why it's quite nice. There's food, there's drinks, and again they will reproduce the social relations from the village. They will call on relatives. We have this kind of gifts of drinks and things to nibble. Then you go to friends. You sort of look towards your enemies with certain with disdain in a way, and that's the only moment when everybody is in the village, and you can see that they did not come there to celebrate as a village or to celebrate any kind of community. Everybody has come for their own dead, for their own private social relations. So there is no, even though it's a collective event, but it's not communal in this sense. Mm-hmm. And finally, just to put like this, is that when what's important about death is that might be the last moment when people might mend social relations. So either on the deathbed or when somebody died, you can come and you can forgive the dead and ask for forgiveness, and this might offer a chance for the living to rekindle the social relation. Maybe they can like sort of make peace, and they might start visiting each other again. However, there is this saying about relatives who've entered into conflict. When you want to say that they are like those two cousins that are not on speaking terms, people say they don't even come to each other's dead. So if you don't come to relatives dead, that's like a honest, conspicuous, honest signal that I don't acknowledge this kin relation and I don't care. So there was this famous case when I was there of two brothers who had this really vicious conflict. They were even neighbors. Each of them built a 4-meter fence towards the other, it was really hilarious, you know. And when one of them died, the other brother did not come. So he did not come to the wake, he did not come to the funeral, nothing. And people were sort of expecting this. But that really sends a signal that what that man did, and his family, of course, by not coming, is saying that he wasn't a real brother to me. Mm-hmm. I mean, he's dead, and I don't care about that. Right? Actually, people were joking that he's probably happy he's buying rounds of drinks because he's happy that his brother died. So, in a way, the death is a final reckoning of social relations, and then you can see how many people are coming. So if there's somebody of high status, then they will have a lot of relatives, a lot of friends coming, paying their respects, and also, how much will the family invest? This is something, again, that I've started actually developing more and looking in a comparative perspective, because it's also a moment when the close associates of the dead will continue this kind of social contract of mutualism. So let's say, so this person has died, but this does not mean in a way that it's okay, we finished this. No, it's enduring, at least for a while, because for example, the family will invest quite a lot of things in a funeral. So they will give, for example, gifts to people who come to the funeral. Yeah. But these gifts are not identical. So like really close relatives will get very precious gifts. Other relatives will get like more distant, or again, not necessarily genealogically distant, but more like morally distant. So people with whom you cooperate less, they will get lesser gifts. And then there are generic gifts which are given to everybody. But then again, there's also like a conspicuous absence of gifts. So because they are calling to someone, and people are paying a lot of attention to this. And if they say, oh, but there was that nephew, and they didn't give them a gift. Oh, so they're not on welcome. So they're in like bad terms and so on. So you show during a funeral because everybody's looking there. It's like a social theater in which you can express these are our moral relations, and the others, well, they can go to hell or something like this. And in a way, for people, the way they are dying and what will happen during funerals and other commemorations is a sign of the worthiness of their life. And if, for example, if people don't have children, or if their children have left and they're sure they won't return, sometimes you have this kind of late life adoption. They will find like a young couple, or maybe like maybe they don't have land or they don't have a house, but they have a good reputation for being hardworking, and they will adopt them. They will leave the house and maybe some other what wealth they have. And what's important is to be supported during the final years of life. But for a lot of people, what's very, very important is to be buried in an honorable way, and for these adoptees to perform the rituals. So anyway, it's like a surrogate biological kinship. And again, to put it in more kind of anthropological terms, is this idea that during a funeral, you really see what's the utmost social value in a society. You can see, so what does it really matter? What brings life or vitality into a society? So is it community? Is like society overall? No. Because if you're dead and if the village is going to bury you, that means that you've left behind no meaningful personal social relations. Mm-hmm. But if you've led like a good life, then you had this kind of moral contracts of mutualism, which will become activated also after your death. So it means you've been like a good person, somebody who has lived an honorable life. Mm-hmm. So it's this element of creating personal, strong relationships of morality with people, preferably kin, but if not kin, then other kind of people that are going to resist even after your death. So in a way, this is the moral value that makes the society endure. So it's not the group, it's this kind of personal relations.
Mm-hmm. With the kind of social fragmentation that you've been talking about in Sateni, give us an overview of how politics works there and how it emerges from this social fragmentation.
Yeah. So when I started looking at politics, I realized that it's not enough to understand what goes on at the grassroots level, since in politics you'll always have this kind of top-down elements that come from how is politics organized at like central level, at like national level, and of course, but this was not necessarily, I didn't focus on this so much, but I was interested in, okay, so we have an idea of what happens in politics in Bucharest or at the county level, but how do villagers meet this kind of opportunities and constraints? And what we see is that there is a interesting adaptation of local social relations and morality that in a way meets the top-down approach. So as you said, there is social fragmentation, but it's an interesting kind of social fragmentation. It's a social fragmentation which does not create durable, enduring fractures. So there is, because you don't have this kind of essentialized groups that will be in conflict today or in 10 years or 10 years ago. There will always be this kind of moral social relationships in dynamic association. So, and I think in a lot of this kind of present society, we're talking about this kind of clientelism or patronage. So patron-client relations, in which you have certain key individuals which have access to resources, whether it's money, but especially kind of political resources like access to public officials, to higher administration, and this gives them a lot of leverage. And they will create around them factions. They will start with relatives, like close relatives first, then more distant relatives, and then like friends or business associates. And they will start creating kind of person-based or person-centered networks, and that will expand. And then these factions are always, in competition with one another. Whoever amasses more social support will then prevail in elections. Because the system is still based on democratic elections, and they're quite free, they're relatively free, and so in this sense, you might say it's democracy at work, right? But then when people are going to vote, they're not voting for like a party, like an ideology. And actually, if you wouldn't know the parties, you wouldn't be able to. I mean, if you just look at some political leaders, you wouldn't realize if they're left wing or right wing or whatever. At the grassroots level, it's more about the person. So it's really person, it's not ideology. I think that most people don't really care about ideology. It's about whom they're going to trust to elect, especially as a mayor. That's the most important part, since the mayor controls most of the resources in the village, the mayor and the local council. So you have this kind of big manship politics. You have men, and especially men, males, who are more assertive, more charismatic, and they will start growing a faction around them. They're also like physically imposing. It sometimes helps, since sometimes politics gets a bit can get a bit aggressive. And they will start this kind of manipulating resources, activating, let's say, their higher patrons. For example, one of the guys I've known, he started into politics like this, since there was somebody from a nearby town who wanted to run for the European Parliament. And the guy was a businessman, and he gave him about 200 pairs of boots. I told him, okay, here are the boots, get me some votes. And in a way, that's what he did. So his local representative came with the boots, and he started distributing them. And First of all, he gave them to like close family and close relatives, and then he started giving them strategically to people. But again, his interests were not perfectly aligned, since he sometimes gave boots to people that he knew they're not going to vote for that European Parliament guy, but they were his connections, right? So he had to honor contract, and some of them he gave them transactionally by extracting some sort of a promise that they're going to vote. And so this is in a way, it's like a small anecdote, but it's an example of how politics is run, which is in a highly transactional matter. And of course, the mayor and his faction are also using public resources in this transactional form. So in a way, and what is fascinating is that, on one hand, people they know, and they also seem to be okay in a way with this private use of public funds, public resources. I mean, they expect that whoever will get into power will not be this kind of objective official. No, he's going to try to get rich, and he's going to try to benefit his faction. And also, he will try to get some things done for the village. But nobody is expecting any kind of altruism, any kind of politician who's going to sacrifice himself for the good of the community. Well, quite far from it. And actually, people are sometimes afraid of such naive individuals since they think that they won't manage to do any kind of good because they know they have to interact with other politicians who are shrewd. And if you're like naive and starry-eyed, then you won't stand a chance. So what you want is someone who is pretty ruthless, who knows how to manipulate, who has the right connections, and they hope that some of these things will trickle down the level of the village. But then they see that public resources get appropriated. So like things like the mayoralty has like a truck and another kind of tool that will be used for the private benefit of public officials. And people don't have a problem with this. What they want is, from their point of view, is how do I get that truck also to do something for me?
Yeah.
I mean, and in a way, it's quite a rational attitude. I mean, it's what they want is to maximize their own private benefit. And since there is no way to sort of organize as a community, since there is no institution which has enough trust to bring a majority of the village around them, except by these elements, by these kind of big man patrons, that everybody's in a way on his own. And then they try to negotiate one by one with officials by using, maybe they have like a common relative, and they ask that common relative, I need some gravel on my road, can you help me, and so on, and somehow they will get it done. And they don't really care how much is being stolen or misappropriated, since a lot of the money is not being redistributed at national level. Mm-hmm. So people, they don't feel they're paying out of their own pocket. And in a way, they're right, since, I mean, that's a system about how local governance in Romania is administered, since this village, being a poor village, is a net beneficiary of funds. So basically, most of the money that come are being paid by taxes collected elsewhere. So people represent that, okay, so it's Bucharest or the state who sends money, and there'll be these gatekeepers. They will keep some for them, and then other parts will go to other lower level officials. Let's see how much ends up on my street, or maybe I can get like a job, or someone in my family will benefit. Right? So this is so fragmentation means that everybody is in a way on his own. And those who have the higher resources will end up in positions of power.
Mm-hmm. So I would like to get now into distrust, since you mentioned at the beginning that this was one of the most puzzling aspects of Sateni society, the widespread distrust and low levels of large-scale cooperation you found there. So, but first of all, how is trust established and maintained before we get into distrust?
Yeah. So there was another thing I wanted to say about fragmentation. Okay. The fact that since these factions are always in dynamic refashioning, you won't get perennial conflict. So you might be the sworn enemy of another big man today, mm-hmm. but in 2 years you might become the best allies. And this has actually happened while I was there. So nothing, in a way, nothing is forever. So you won't have like one part of the village which is in conflict with another part of the village. Everything is up in the air, so to speak. So by common relatives or common friends, you can become allies. Then maybe there's a betrayal and you become enemies, and so on and so forth. So since the village is ethnically homogeneous, so there are only Romanians, since ideology doesn't play a role in this, there are no essential distinctions between people. What you have is these networks of kinship and friendship, and there is enough degrees of freedom for any combination to appear there. And this won't create any kind of radical conflict. Also, since you might be an enemy with someone, but you might have some common relatives, and you might be friends. So you are friends with that common relative, and he's friends with them. So at each point, there is a possibility of disconnection or connection. And this explains in a way why you can have political fragmentation, but it's rather stable. So there will be no large-scale conflict. There will be no large-scale fights. It's the peace brought by multiple transactions, in a way. And nothing is no political fight is fought on this kind of transcendental values of like ethnic group or nation or class or so on. So this pragmatism, although it creates corruption, although it creates kind of neo-patrimonialism in politics, it also ensures this kind of low-level equilibrium of social stability. So now, getting to
trust.
Exactly. So the first, the way I see it, an actor in this society will start looking first at his network of kinship, and those. So you'll receive by birth and by your family certain trusting relationships. So in a way they are inherited. So if your parents were friends with another family, then you will interact with them and with their children. So you will establish when growing up, you will establish your primary relations, and this will be especially among relatives. And then, of course, people start interacting beyond kinship. So, and of course, so that first it's like blood relatives, and then you have like through marriage. And marriage is another moment in which you can create some new relations. And then and these kind of life events and rituals that are associated with them are some of the places in which you establish trust. So by this kind of symbolic gesture of I come to your wedding, you come to my wedding. So it shows like just like a good you're a nice person, but it also creates this what anthropologists call like gift relations. Because if I come to your wedding, then even though nobody is saying it, there is this obligation that you unspoken one that you should come to my wedding or to wedding of somebody in my family as well. And as long as everybody plays along this game, they show that they are trustworthy. If they stop, then well, they show their. And then there are certain ways to gain trust. For example, by third parties vouching for you. So sometimes, for example, people need to interact with business. For example, like a lot of people some people are growing sheep. Some of them become shepherds with quite a lot of animals, and shepherds, since their pastures are sometimes in other villages, they need to find partners there. And a good way to find such a partner is to see if in your personal network you'll find somebody who has another partner there. And that person will vouch for you. So you go there, and let's say you have like a godparent, and that godparent has a cousin there. And you'll join him, and together you'll go there. And there's this very interesting social dramaturgy of people who are coming, and it just seems like a friendly affair. You just, so they put on the table for you, exchange drinks. And if you wouldn't know about it, it seems that it's just like people being friendly. But actually, everybody knows that at some point there will be like an important business proposal, something like this. And why should I trust you? I don't know you. Well, yeah, but you've come with my relative. And if my relative says that you are trustworthy and you're honorable, then this gives me a reason to trust you initially. So I think this is one of the most important elements. And of course, reputation is very important as well. So people talk a lot about others. There's a lot of gossip. And and you can find out through other people pretty much what everybody did. In fact, you can find out even things that they didn't do, since there are many like fabulations, like stories being exaggerated and so on. But by and large, one could say that public reputation is a rather is a good enough measure of whether we can trust someone. But again, it's also a form like a third-party vouching is more like distributed. For example, the guy I work with, so like my master builder, most of the clients came to him because somebody told them that, oh, I know about this builder and he's very honest. He works. He's not cheap, he's quite expensive, but he really delivers on his projects. And people came to him because they found out from others, and he had a pretty good reputation around the village. On the other hand, some people do have a reputation for being like, I don't know, drunkards or thieves or lazy and so on. And then people will avoid them. So this is, reputation is really, really important. And because it's so important, people are very careful about what the others know or see about them. And actually, this is and this again returns us to that theme of the household. So they really try to, and in the household, but also in social interactions, they really try to put on the best image of themselves, right? So their household, for example, the parts of the households which are visible to others are much cleaner, they're really organized and well tended to. If you go into the back of the house, things might be messier there. But that's not important because people don't see it. What is important is what people see on the outside. Right? Yeah. Because this will establish your reputation that you... And in fact, what I've understood at some point is that, because I was thinking about, okay, but don't people know that others will just manage their reputation? So it isn't like hypocrisy. But actually, it's quite interesting is that the fact that you care about your reputation and you really want to put on a show, it already establishes the fact that you care about what the others think about you. It doesn't matter how you actually are, but the fact that you put on effort, that you invest in your reputation, it shows that even in the future, in your interaction with me, you really care about this. And actually, and somebody whose reputation is unsavory, I mean, they say about these kind of people that they have no shame. And if you don't have no shame, it shows that you don't care about your reputation. And somebody who doesn't care about their reputation is like a loose cannon, right? You cannot trust them because you can't use their reputation as a guarantee. I mean, they might cheat you, they might harm you, and what can you do about it? Well, you will tell everybody. Well, and they don't care about their reputation. So don't interact with that person. So it matters less what are like the true motives of people. Since people know that you can't, I mean, they say that you can't really know what's inside a person. But what you can know is how much do they care about what the others think about them. And even if they have like suspicions about the true motives, the fact that somebody is very much afraid of being publicly shamed, it's a guarantee that you can interact with them with a certain certainty, that with some certainty that you won't be cheated. So again, right, since there are since also there is very little one can do to so if you are cheating something like this, there is very little resource to like law or contracts or something like this. So there's no expectation that anyone will do you any justice.
Mm-hmm. So generally speaking, when would you say distrust is a reasonable and perhaps even a rational strategy in human societies?
Well, I'll start by looking at this village in particular, and then perhaps extrapolating to general terms. Well,
Yeah.
in this village, when you look at distrust in this moment, you really have to understand its historical origins. And when you start talking to people, collecting personal histories, you realize that this is not something which was only present here or in the last years. It's something that goes a long way back. And you can see that there are certain historical phenomena which have created distrust as a reasonable strategy. And this has to do with, if you go long enough, it starts with a special kind of feudal system in Romania, where you had like boyars and serfs, and then the serfs got, they became free peasants, but without land, and they still remained dependent upon landowners. And then after that, and then you had some sort of after the First World War, there was some land reforms. So they got some land, but then it was not enough. It was always this problem of people ending up in zero-sum games. So the quantity of land was limited, and your competitor was always your fellow villager. So you didn't compete against other villages, you didn't compete against foreigners and so on. The enemy was within, so to speak. And then you had the communist period, which was a dictatorship, and that probably continued or even increased the level of distrust between people, since it added this level of like a totalitarian state that was trying to exploit, actually was really exploiting peasants, and everybody was trying to manage somehow on their own to survive, and that meant doing illegal things that they considered to be moral, such as stealing from the collective farm, because they thought that the land was theirs. The kind of payment they got from the farm was really, really meager, and they felt entitled to steal. And everybody was stealing, and it was considered absolutely moral. They thought that, how they put it, the one that doesn't steal from the farm steals from his children's mouth. So, but this also created a risk that somebody is going to inform on you. So somebody might take revenge from some conflict, and they will call the police or the party officials, and you might go to jail. And this added another level of distrust, since people were not, on the one hand, they were all stealing or doing illegal things, but they were doing it individually or by family. They were not doing it as a group. And there was always a risk that somebody is going to be a defector in a way, and is going to cooperate with the authorities. And this again added another layer of secrecy and distrust between people. So, and this continued with after the end of communism, even when the people got their money, land back, and so on. So for this village, what we could see is that there are very few opportunities for plus-sum games between people. For the kind of opportunities in which you had a significant number of people working together for, let's say, a common project. since most of their livelihood was based around families, like private, like small domestic, this kind of domestic mode of production. Since there was very little specialization, like division of labor, everybody was pretty much doing the same thing. Of course, some of them were richer, some of them were poorer, but by and large, most were peasants. So in a way, people did not really need to interact with others. So you did not have this kind of what might be called market relationships, in which somebody specializes on something and then becomes dependent upon others, and others are also dependent upon others is they specialize as well. Since the general strategy was this kind of low risk approach in which I need to secure as much means of production as I can for my own family and for myself. I don't want to depend upon others. So this lowered the opportunities to engage in this kind of common projects. So people had they have many opportunities to cooperate with others, and everybody gained from this. Rather, they were all competing for the same kind of limited resources, such as land or pasture rights or political power and so on. And all of these are, in a way, zero-sum games. Mm-hmm. The only sphere where you could have this kind of cooperation was that of kinship, that happened between families and then with close relatives, with marriage and so on. And this is why this is the only domain where we can find some an increased trust in others, but which also comes with the kind of risks of default, right? Risks of being taken advantage of. So in general, if you know about why is distrust a reasonable strategy? No, in a way, it's I think both trust or distrust, it's kind of social equilibria which can be self-fulfilling. So if you, for example, if other people don't trust you, there is no opportunity for you to become to unilaterally trust. Because if they don't trust you, then they will preemptively perhaps take an advantage of you, thinking that you will take advantage of them if they don't do, right? Can one trust? Is this an optimal strategy to start trusting? So saying like, listen, from now on, I'm going to trust that everybody is a fair cooperator and I'm going to cooperate with everyone. No, because this is a losing strategy, right? You'll get either cheated or there'll be some form of predation. So how can you shift from this kind of low-level equilibrium to another equilibrium? There needs to be some sort of a focal point, something around which people can coordinate and say, okay, now we will move to this position in which there is a higher amount of trust. But it's not individually, but it's somehow coordinated by the entire group. Well, in this village, I don't think any kind of political or economic phenomenon offered this kind of element of a shift. So the church did not provide it, political parties did not offer it, and so on. Something which might change, and I think I've started seeing at least some elements of it, is when people start having a longer time horizon. Mm-hmm. So if you look at the history, you have people who grew up and they developed into really harsh environments. And there's this very interesting approach, the life history analysis, theory or analysis, which is that, well, our inclinations will, to an important extent, they will develop during our early life experiences. And if we develop in harsh environments, unpredictable, with high competition over resources and so on, then there is an entire life strategy which focuses on the short term with rapid gratification, low tolerance for social friction, opportunism, living fast, dying, this kind of thing. I think this is something which can be observed even for a very large part of the 20th century. For example, the last major famine was after the Second World War, and it was like a total social collapse. Right? Because everybody was dying of hunger, and there was no opportunity to get help from your neighbor because your neighbor was also starving. Right? These kind of harsh environments created, hypothesis that they created a society composed of individuals who really thought about the short term and had low levels of trust and only like close people. Now, but when environments become more affluent, they become more predictable, there are more resources, then theory suggests that there's going to be a shift in motivations and inclinations of people. And I think this might be observed already even in this village. Since from, at least in the past decades, let's say at least the basic resources of like food and security became more or less predictable. So there was no longer this kind of really intense competition. I think that for many people there has been a change in life orientation. So they became more oriented towards the long term. They became more tolerant to temporary imbalances, so they became a bit more generous. There's been like less opportunism, like less. Given a chance to deceive or to betray, they will forgo it, right? And instead establishing kind of long-term cooperative partnerships. And I think that for the younger generations, so people aged like, let's say, 40 or less, some of them growing up in more affluent environments, you can see that there's been a sort of a change. They start thinking in more universalistic terms. I mean, this is something fascinating. For example, religion. Although Christian religion has this kind of universalist ideology, if you look at how people, like especially like older people, look at it, it's very particularistic. So this idea of doing good for the greater humankind or for the community is not really something which is appealing to them. For them, they interpret all this as being kind to your people, to your family, and so on. So it doesn't really work. Maybe in some discourses they do talk about this kind of general morality, but no, for them morality is particularistic. I have a moral contract with this person, I'll be nice to them. The others, well, they're not my relatives, they're not my close people, to each his own. Now, these younger generations, they seem to engage more in this kind of universalist framework of thinking about the entire humankind, perhaps also because they've been exposed more to, let's say, other societies, or they've traveled beyond their village and so on. And they become preoccupied with things like corruption and general good and so on. They seem to invest more in themselves, like skills. They're not so much interested just like getting as many resources as I can right now. They invest more in the long term. They have, for example, and you can see this shift especially in demographics. So let's say people 2 generations ago, they had lots of kids. And this created also a problem of land fragmentation, since you had to split the inheritance among like 6 or 7. Nowadays, family sets are becoming much, much lower. So people have like 1, 2, maybe 3 kids at most. It's only the poor that still have a lot of people. So this is also a sign that people invest more. So there's a larger investment in a smaller number of children, which again should lead to this kind of long-term life strategy. And this creates one element which might increase trust among people. On the other hand, if you look at things like the political system, that's the top-down political system, that's not really a source of increased trust. Since, at this level, we're talking about like national politics, in which you do have a lot of clientelism and patronage. And in a way, what people see and in the national politics and the kind of let's say relationships that get established with a village, they increase distrust in like authorities, institutions, and so on. We haven't discussed about this, but people really don't trust the state. They don't trust the state. They don't even trust like national lotteries. They think they're rigged. And for example, because I'm still in contact with this village, there's been a very low vaccination rate. People really don't trust. And it was really hard to predict this. They don't trust the state. They don't trust companies. They think that everybody's for themselves. And actually, there's been a lot of people dying there, especially like old people. And it was quite predictable that they won't trust such campaigns. So it's one of the things that that come out from the general outlook of low trust in generic institutions or unknown people.
So, taking into account these high levels of distrust we find in Sateni society, and at least to some extent it seems counterintuitive from what we know about trust in human societies and the role it plays. It's still the case that it seems that at least to a certain extent they are able to keep society stable, perhaps through the mechanisms that you mentioned when we talked about politics, that perhaps particularly in the realm of politics and perhaps in other kinds of relationships, they are not really established on the basis of ideology or essentialism, but they are more transactional and circumstantial perhaps, and perhaps my enemy today is my ally tomorrow and vice versa. Do you think that could also tell us something about larger scale societies? Is it because we're talking about a small scale society here that this works? And would it be the case that it wouldn't really work in larger scale societies, and that's why we have, for example, political polarization instead of this combination of sort of distrust together with transactional and circumstantial relationships that still keep society stable and not really divide people into two or more groups that get in a conflict with one another?
Yeah, this is something that I've. So my fieldwork was about 13 years ago, and sometimes I'm looking, for example, at U.S. politics, and this is something that always comes to mind in comparison with kind of small scale society. So the way I see it, what we have in U.S. Politics is a really deep polarization with, let's say, at least two large factions, which are, and each faction has this kind of articulation of like moral values, identity, even like tastes coming from religion and family and music and everything, and they're pretty much clearly established, right? And it's really hard to see how people can move from one to the other one, right? So they seem like there's like a front line there. And in a way, what is fascinating is so very large-scale societies can create this kind of overall group identities based on like things like politics or religion, and they actually need some sort of a narrative to bring all these people together. And there's been in like for example, in like cognitive science of religion, this discussion of how do we get from small-scale societies, and I think that a lot of small-scale societies, what I call like tribal societies and so on, look exactly like this. They are quite transactional and so on. But how do you get from that to large-scale societies with anonymity, with this kind of trust in fellow ethnics and so on. I don't think there's a very clear answer to that. It probably has to do something with social complexity, the role of like centralization of violence, of like military, and also this is something quite important, with competition with other groups. For example, I mean, if I look at this village, they're not competing against anyone else. They're competing against themselves. So every other villager might be another competitor or an ally, depending, as you said, on the context, right? But there's been no moment in which you said, oh, it's we, Sateni, against the others. There are no others. So the others are wrong among us and might be my brother or my neighbor and so on. And I thought that, and as a counterfactual thinking, if somehow, let's say, the neighboring village would have, they've had some sort of a conflict with them, perhaps some sort of an identity of, oh, it's us, Sateni villager against them. This would might have created some institutions to create social bonds, to create like this kind of fellow feeling among themselves. But this was obviously lacking, right? So in a way, what we see in large-scale societies, I think we should look more at the fact that what keeps people together is some form of perhaps like a common enemy. Or if it's not a common enemy, at least it's some sort of a common cause people find. So what we see in the States, we see this kind of, I mean, we have polarization, but there is also strong group feeling in each one of them. Well, we're speculating, it might be perhaps that there is no clear external enemy anymore. Since during the Cold War, okay, maybe you had like conservatives or liberals, but at least everybody was against the totalitarian regimes of Soviet Union and so on. But once these have disappeared, then it was the war against terror. But slowly there was no external source of fear and so on, and then it got that the enemy is within us. But at least it's still groups. It's not everybody against everybody. It's still according to certain lines. So I think this would suggest that a strong element in creating inner trust is I trust you because I need you to fight against somebody else. And once there is no common project of defense, or perhaps it can be sort of on a positive note, maybe we can achieve something. So if you don't have these kind of elements, then you have social fragmentations, because there are so many elements upon which people might enter into conflict with one another. And of course, I mean, social interactions are always rife with misaligned interests. Mm-hmm. And it doesn't mean that in large-scale societies, all people are generous and altruistic and so on towards others. No, you have frictions, you have conflicts, but there is like an overall project. There is something which, so like in a way, what keeps us together is stronger than the forces that might drive us apart. Now, when that the keep us together element is missing, then you'll have this kind of and social entropy of social fragmentation. And I think that that's one of the interesting elements in the history of this village and also of Romania in general, this kind of pragmatism and transactionalism of social relations, which is highly adaptable, which can adapt itself to various political regimes, whether it's the pre-communist quasi-democracy or the totalitarian state or the post-communist realities and so on. And people with this particularistic morality always found a way to survive and to adapt their relationships without creating any kind of essentialized groups or boundaries. And on the other hand, without having this kind of strong cooperation, strong inner cooperation. So it's a very it's a stable, low equilibrium. I might call something like prudent sociality. So you might not get the best outcome, but at least you don't risk social collapse. So you'll just it's like a survival strategy rather than a growth strategy that you got. And another thing that something that my fieldwork made me think, and something I became quite skeptical of, are all these theories about like cultural group selection. All the people who are saying that somehow we have this kind of in-group bias, that we have parochial altruism, that we all always identify with our people against others. And I'm not saying that's not true. It might happen, but we need some certain particular context for that to appear. And there are many other social contexts, and I think we can find them in many traditional societies when where the in-group is not really clear. Who is the in-group? I think that a lot of what is being discussed in this kind of cultural group selection is influenced by an image of national states with clear ethnicity, with clear identities. And of course, in many tribal societies, you do have that. This is a Nuer, this is a Dinka, and so on. But if we really look into in the ethnographic accounts, we see how dynamic these identities are often, and that people are quite pragmatic in this kind of in their cooperative strategies and so on, so they might have an in-group bias, but what exactly is the in-group might vary very much from one year to the next. So it's more about like coalitions, but coalitions can be dynamic. So people can enter, they can leave them, and they can fashion their coalitions for the kind of purposes that they have. So this is why, so given my experience of fieldwork, I haven't seen that the villagers of Sateni have any kind of strong inclination to be cooperative towards their in-group, unless we define in-group something like relatives. But if you define it as relatives, then you can see, okay, but who's a relative? And then you see that the definition is very much contextual, pragmatic, and it depends upon the life history of one person, idiosyncratic events, and so on, and always flexible. So that's why I'm more tending towards this idea that morality is more about mutualism, is about more based on intuitions of fairness. And what happens when you don't have opportunities for mutual cooperation? Then you want these kind of norms of generalized trust will not establish, right? They will not gain ground. Even when you have like the church or the state offering this kind of ideologies, because they're not sustained by the facts on the ground, by economic opportunities, by political points, and so on, they will just remain at the level of discourse.
Mm-hmm. So I think that was a pretty good summary of the lessons we can draw from your ethnography when it comes to perhaps having a clearer and more broader understanding of human cooperation and morality, how it works and how diverse it can be in terms of expression in particular contexts and ecologies. So again, the book is Living with Distrust, Morality and Cooperation in a Romanian Village. Would you like to mention where people can find you and your work on the internet before we go?
So I think I have a ResearchGate page, and I think on academia.edu as well. I sometimes use my Twitter account, but I'm not a prolific tweeter, as I've seen that most academics are these days. I'm thinking of gathering all my stuff on a personal web page. That's perhaps a project for the end of this year. Yeah, and there's one thing I would like to mention. Since about the role of distrust, I think that a lot of academics, since they're living in very high trust societies, they think that in a way that social trust is the default of social interactions. And I think that if we look at the ethnographic record, we see that for the largest amount of time and in most cultures, distrust was actually the default mode in interacting with people in general. It's rather, so in a way, trust is the thing that needs to be achieved, and it's very vulnerable to being destroyed. I mean, it's really hard to create trust, but it's very easy to destroy it. So, but because, so there might be this kind of social bias that we have as people living in developed, rich, affluent, and safe societies, because we see so much trust. Distrust seems in a way pathological. Actually, it might be the other way around. So the explanation, so we should actually understand how does this very vulnerable and very, very, of course, very precious, element of trust, how can it get established and reproduced? Since there might be some truth to the idea that for the largest part of human history, there was a strong element of Hobbesian mistrust between people. Of course, not all of it. There were certain pockets of trust based on kinship and personal relations. But how did we get to societies like the Nordic countries with high levels of trust? Then anyway, it's the exception that needs more explanation, I think.
Mm-hmm. So that I think is a great note to end on. Dr. Umbreș, thank you so much for taking the time to come on the show, and it's been a real pleasure to talk to you.
Thank you very much, Ricardo. Thank you very much for allowing me to share some of my thoughts. And thank you for these really great and provoking questions.
Hi guys, thank you for watching this interview until the end. To keep the channel sustainable, I would like to ask you to please visit my Patreon page and to consider making a pledge there. Any amount, even $1 per month, would already be a great help. Otherwise, and if you like what I'm doing, please share it, leave a like and hit the subscription button. This show is brought to you by Enlights Learning and Development Done Differently. Check their website at enlights.com. I would also like to give a huge thank you to my main patrons and PayPal supporters, Karen Litske and Blanchett Perga Larsen, Lau Guerrero, Francis Ford, Hans Frederick Sunder, Ricardo Vladimiro, Greg Healy, Adam Castle, Olaf Alex, Jonathan Vissel, Jacob Klinkby, Matthew Whittingbird, Arno Wolfkin, Tim Hollis, Henry Kalenia, John Connors, Paulina Barron, Philip Force Connolly, Jerry Mueller, Herbert Gintis, Bo Weingard, Rebecca Neuberger Goldstein, Dan Demetrio, Robert Windiger, Rui Inácio, Arthur Coe, Zup, Marco Neves, Colin Holbrook, Susan Pinker, Bernardo Seixas, Pablo Santurbano, Simon Colombo, Jorge Spinha, Phil Kavanagh, Corey Clark, Mark Blythe, Roberto Inguanzo, Michael Stormir, Samuel Andreev, Tiago Nunes, Bernard Hughney, Alexander Dunbauer, Fergal Cusson, Evan Bodrenko, Al Herzog, Don Ross, Jonathan Librand, Oslan Bullitt, Nathan Nguyen, Stanton T, Samuel Correa, Eric Hines, Mark Smith, J.W., João Eira, Tom Hummel, David Sloan Wilson, Yacila Dez Araújo, Eden Solon, Romain Roach, Dmitry Grigoriev, Diego Londonio Correa, Tom Roth, Yannick Punter, Adana Rusmani, Charlotte Bliss, Nicole Barbaro, Adam Hunt, Pavel Ostazewski, Nelek Bach, Catherine and Patrick Tobin, Al Ortiz, Guy Madison, Gary G. Hellman, João Linhares, Lida Cosmides, Saima Afzal, Adrian Yegi, Nick Golden, Paulo Tolentino, João Barbosa, Jules Price, Edward Hall, Edin Bronner, Franca Bortolotti, Gabriel Pons Cortez, Ursula Litske, Denise Cook, Scott, Zachary Fish, Tim Duffy, and Max Belby. My producers Isar Webb, Jim Frank, Lucas Stafiniak, Ian Gilligan, Luís Caetano, Tom Vanagdam, Curtis Dixon, João Linhares, Benedict Mueller, Vega Guidi, Sardas Francis, Thomas Trumbull, and Nuno Welder. And my executive producers Michel Rugieski, Rosie, James Pratt, Matthew Lavender, Sergio Codriano, and Bogdan Kanivets. Thank you for all.